I'm Rachel Dyke, Senior Director of Global Pricing here at Flexport, and I'm joined by Tony Crisafulli, our Senior Director of Global Bid Management, and Daniel Fialos, our Manager of Global Bid Pricing. So today we're going to be discussing how to find the right freight forwarder for your business needs through running a comprehensive RFP process. Just take a minute to note, we are recording this webinar, and we're going to send out the recording and slides before the end of the week. I also want to take a moment to say that running a formal RFP process is not the only way to find the right freight forwarder who can solve your pain points. There's a number of other formats you can use to evaluate a freight forwarder against your requirements.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And this is Tony Crisafulli. Welcome. And first, I'd like to just say that an RFP or request for proposal can be referred to as many different items, RFQ, bid, tender, but for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to use RFP to represent the full bid process. And so essentially there are two general approaches that we can take towards conducting an RFP. One is a formal RFP and the other is an informal RFP. And the best practices we'll cover today will allow you to tailor fit your RFP process to your specific business needs. So first, let's start with what the formal RFP looks like, and really why would you use a formal versus informal? So typically, a formal RFP is required, it could be required by your internal company policy. So for example, large spend equals an RFP, or where there's a separate procurement department from the logistics organization. Typically large, very complex point pairs would be very suitable for a formal RFP because it makes the process a bit more efficient. And lastly, where there are many suppliers and somewhat of an opaque market would be really good conditions for using a formal RFP. And an informal RFP is kind of the inverse of that. So the spend is a bit smaller, you have fewer point pairs, you have trusted suppliers and close relationships, and there is somewhat of a transparent market in terms of price that you could baseline off of. Fortunately for the forwarding market, you can use either. So for example, there is a Shanghai Freight Index where if you do not feel like or have the resources to launch a formal RFP, you could kind of baseline off of that Shanghai Freight Index to kind of figure out where your pricing is coming in compared to that index.
Great, thanks, Tony. So for those less familiar with an RFP process, the main purpose is to really gather the necessary info from a select group of potential service providers to determine the best partners for your supply chain. There are a few different types of RFPs and things to consider when running this process, so let's jump in. A traditional RFP process can add value by helping you get lower rates through competition amongst providers for your business. It can provide you with benchmarks for what's available in the market around rates and services. The structure of a traditional RFP really allows you to compare offerings and rates across these providers. The format can create an easy way to evaluate how these providers stack up against each other and if they meet your supply chain needs. However, these traditional RFPs can have some gaps that may leave you needing more.
Great. So a value-driven RFP, to just build on what Daniel referenced, which is the traditional RFP, really heavily focused on the buy price or the price that's out there. We can kind of develop that further and allow you to add additional value to your organization and on top of the traditional RFP process. And this could be done through two avenues. First would be total cost of ownership, and the second would be to align with your forwarder's capabilities or service capabilities. Okay, and so next we'll cover how you can use both TCO, I'll refer to total cost of ownership as TCO, and of course service capabilities as your forwarder's capabilities. So a traditional RFP, as we reference, is focused mainly on price, and of course price is a very important component for TCO, but other less visible costs may creep into the total costs that you pay for your freight. For example, visibility. The ability to know where your SKUs are while in transit is very valuable. The ability to locate that inventory and divert to destinations not only will save transportation costs, but will also improve your sales and manufacturing process to get your inventory to the right place that it is needed. So having that visibility versus not having that could certainly increase or decrease your total cost. Another culprit that we see repeatedly is booking acceptance and even rolling when the booking is accepted. So you have your inventory, it's ready to roll, it's booked, the container's received at origin, but the container maybe is rolled. Clearly that's a problem. That's going to increase your costs in terms of for wait time carrying your inventory, maybe missing an important marketing campaign or seasonal deadline. And lastly, invoicing accuracy. That's another issue that we see again and again, where the price that you were quoted may not necessarily be the price that you're invoiced, and then you have to kind of reconcile that. That takes a lot of effort. It's an extremely frustrating process. So these are just 3 examples of how during the RFP process, the cost can really creep into your overall total cost without you really being aware of it and without evaluating your forwarders for these capabilities. And so next up is more on the service side. And there are 3 factors of many that I've chosen here: strategic fit, the network fit, and account management. And the strategic fit really is to ask yourself the question, to what extent does the forwarder provide solutions that meets all of your supply chain needs? And then next up is really the network fit. And that's really, what is the forwarder's scope? Are they really just focused on one mode, or do they provide many different modes, including customs clearance and warehousing services? And lastly, and probably equally as important, is account management. And account management is so critical for when you are in a pinch and you need additional capacity. You have some of the issues above, like invoicing accuracy. What type of account management structure does the forwarder offer? Do you have access to customer service individuals, operational individuals? Is there an escalation point? So really balancing total cost and service will help you find the best rate forwarder for your company's specific needs. And transparent pricing and service terms, as we've highlighted here, are key hallmarks for a reliable forwarder.
Thanks, Tony. So when you're thinking about running a value-driven RFP, it's of course key to know what services you actually need and what value you expect those services to deliver to your business. In other words, how do you make sure that your pain points are actually addressed? So for example, how much allocation do you need each week or each month? How does that vary during the year? Is it important to you that the services are direct or even premium? Or is it okay, if not, maybe even preferable, that the service is deferred? So once you've answered these questions for yourself, then you can structure your RFP and start to ask the provider questions about the value of each service. So some of the most common challenges that we see in the outcomes of RFPs, and we've touched on this a bit here, is basically that the RFP becomes a race for price and only price. And an RFP can sort of run the risk of being so rigid in structure that it's only focused on very limited aspects of service. And so you might focus so much on comparing vendors apples to apples, which is the major benefit of an RFP, that you're unable to consider how to actually get more out of that vendor.
Great. And we've highlighted 3 pitfalls and 3 fixes that we can consider and just kind of discuss a little bit further. And first, as Rachel emphasized here, is an overemphasis on the base price. The price that you're quoted could change over time, not just through the total cost issues that we've highlighted, but through market movements up or down. So a fix there is to really understand how prices will change under different scenarios. And we could get into some of those scenarios, but we recently saw one where unexpectedly tariffs were put in place, or the threat of additional tariffs were put in place. A lot of inventory was pulled forward, demand spiked, capacity was limited. So kind of thinking through some scenarios that might limit capacity and how your price will be impacted by that is very important in terms of your budgeting process once you decide on nominating your forwarders. And so the second pitfall there is misalignment between supplier capabilities and business needs. And of course, the fix there is investing some time in creating a supplier interview guide or an RFI would be great, just to really understand and have the forwarder understand really what is their capabilities and what is your understanding, what is your needs, and making sure that's aligned. So you want to get as close, you want to select a forwarder that can get as close to your specific needs, obviously, as you possibly can. And last up is inconsistent RFP responses. If you've ever run an RFP and the submissions from the suppliers were not following the standard process or submission guidelines that you had outlined, it becomes a very, very arduous task to kind of consolidate all that information and then analyze and make decisions. So insisting on that consistent RFP response is critical to running that, to coming over that pitfall.
Great. So when we think about these pitfalls and the fixes, I think one of the key things that you should be prepared to do is really dig into the rate offerings and the structures of how these proposals are put together. This is definitely where it's key to make sure you find out exactly what is covered in these rate offerings for the services that you are requesting and uncover any potential fees for additional services you may require. Really think about additional time that you may need to handle your cargo, or what's often referred to in the industry as free time or per diem. Think about any additional trucking accessorials you may come across, such as chassis splits. I think that's a major issue in the trucking market right now. Congestion, waiting time, storage, or warehousing. Right? Really think about these scenarios where you'll require additional handling, like document management or any other value-added services that you may need throughout the year, such as warehousing. Next, you really want to allow your providers to offer multiple services and pricing offerings. This is especially important to consider your business forecasts and seasonalities in the market. Really evaluate various routing options to compare speed versus cost effectiveness. Look at different service levels, right? On air, you might want to look at both a premium versus standard offering service and how that might impact your supply chain. Consider your seasonality and potential macro level events that will impact the market. Tony mentioned the tariff situation, which caused an earlier and stronger peak than normal or in years past. To really have your providers highlight how they intend to mitigate risks to these potential increased costs or service failures. This may come in the form of a PSS rate structure or short-term validity or blended rate offers across different lanes for your business. Also to the point that Tony made previously, this is really where you may ask your provider to run different pricing scenarios based on those different structures, routing options, or market impact, so you can understand your potential freight spend. Lastly, you really want to be open to and accept consultation from your freight forwarder and have them consider an outlook of the market so you have set expectations. You want a provider that is an expert in the market dynamics and understands supply chain variabilities. You want a provider that has your best interests in mind and will offer guidance on the benefits of each of the service offerings and pricing structures they put together for you. A partner that can consult you on your potential business needs, the future of the market, and how to plan for both is key in guaranteeing a successful partnership.
Thanks, Daniel. So we've discussed the things that might be important to look for in order to make sure that you're receiving value from your partner. Let's shift gears a bit and discuss how to evaluate these potential providers for the value that you want to receive.
Yes, and I think focusing on some core but really necessary best practices will go a long way towards setting up a solid RFP. And those would likely be key items that we should really consider while creating the RFP from the very beginning. So a couple of topics that we've outlined here, and we could certainly always go deeper in the Q&A section, is really understanding and having and providing accurate volumes per lane. That's so critical, and it seems so elementary, but of course with our businesses constantly changing, supply chain changing, sourcing changing, it may not always be so easy, but the best estimates, of course, will produce some of the best results in terms of the RFP, total cost of ownership. Define your company's needs and requirements in advance. Ideally, a routing guide or areas like air freight and SOP, standard operating procedure, would be very impactful. And so it's very clear what your expectations are, what are the steps that the supplier, the forwarder, is required to follow to be able to meet your specific needs. For example, scanning, etc. Identify areas of focus that improve your supply chain, and this is kind of the consultation aspect that Daniel has referred to. There might be services that are offered that you just might not be aware of, or solutions that other customers are experiencing that the forwarder can bring to the table to help your supply chain. Qualify and disqualify candidates with research in advance. There are many different forwarders out there. It would be really good idea, I think, to kind of pare down the number from the outset. And then, of course, be selective ultimately and limit the number of forwarders you ultimately invite to the RFP. As we know, the RFP is a very time-consuming process, extremely detailed, and requires a lot of resources. So striking the right balance between understanding the market and the number of forwarders will be critical. And lastly, if you're onboarding a new supplier, then perhaps a trial shipment, a number of trial shipments, preferably in advance to the RFP, but even post RFP would be a great idea before you go ahead and commit to a large volume. So once you know who you would like to invite, you have your business needs defined, and then there's areas that you're trying to improve through the RFP, we enter the rate request phase.
Great, thanks, Tony. So there are more to rates than just filling out an RFP template. The lowest rates on paper can be deceiving and attractive, but detrimental if you don't understand them. And Tony mentioned this earlier, but transparency, and especially around rates, is key to ensuring value. Rates are obviously a huge part of vetting for that right value. So in order to request rates, make sure you have a complete and granular rate template that includes all additional accessorial charges and when they would be applied. If you are looking for a recommended template to use, please check out Flexport's blog on 3 things to ask in a freight forwarding proposal by Darius Puskas. Rate templates should be accompanied by SLAs, all service requirements like cargo handling, routing, lead time requirements, rate terms that you are seeking. Providing clarity on what you're looking for gives the providers an opportunity to craft the right proposal and provide clarity on what you would be getting. So as someone who receives these bids, these SLAs really makes me understand what to look for when crafting that right proposal for your business. It's also common for clients to seek fixed pricing terms through RFPs, but those terms may not always be the most favorable for your business based on your volume profile. For example, your volume may be inconsistent on one lane throughout the year, so you may want to consider shorter term rates or different pricing structures for those lanes so you can have more flexibility and reliability in those offerings that you can obtain. We've talked a lot about running different scenario analysis. So after requesting and receiving these rates back from providers, really take the opportunity to run through these different business and market scenarios. Really test cases on your business, assuming your volume grows or shifts to other DCs, or you're sourcing from new suppliers, or if you have a need to expedite some freight. Similarly, test cases on market dynamics, such as peak season surges, reduce or introduction of capacity in the market, or new available services that may come into the market.
Thanks, Daniel. So in addition to the rate requests that Daniel just outlined, you might also want to include some qualitative questions. How you go about this is up to you. You can put together, what we think of as sort of a formal request for information that might be the same questionnaire every provider has to fill out, or you might only include that in later rounds for forwarders that you're most serious about including. Up to you, but we want to walk through some specific questions and question areas. So the first one is following up on pricing terms. So as Tony mentioned, it's easy to focus just on sort of the lowest freight base price, but some pricing terms are often still hidden, right? So even if you have the very detailed rate template that Daniel just discussed, it's typically best to ask if there are any other charges that a shipment might be subject to. And you might even ask the providers to make the rates binding. And you can always confirm that they're binding by comparing your invoice to the RFP proposal that you received from that provider. And we find is a freight forwarder that's open and honest with you about these pricing terms during this process. It's indicative of the value that you'll be able to get from them once you start working with them. From there, you can dive more into service specifics. So ask questions like, what carriers are you using? Is my freight insured? Is that included in the price? Beyond that, you can go towards the company's broader capabilities, and Tony touched on this a bit earlier. But you can ask specific questions around whether the provider is able to both track your cargo and then provide you that visibility to that tracking. You can ask about their reporting and data analytics capabilities. That can help you plan your business better. If it's important to your company, you might even ask the forwarder about their sustainability initiatives. For example, can they help you offset your carbon footprint? And then you can also ask a forwarder how they can keep cargo moving during difficult market conditions. We've mentioned a few sort of difficult market conditions that can pop up. And I think you want to know whether a provider can offer a premium service, for example, like APL Eagle, or even chartered airspace once the air market gets really tight and uplift is generally not very available. And then there's customer service. So I think the most important question to ask here is, how do you measure your customer service? Do you have customer references that I can talk to? Do you track, for example, something like a net promoter score? And the reality is that not all providers regularly measure customer satisfaction, so this question might catch them off guard, but doing so indicates that the customer is actually at the center of their business practices.
Great. So thinking more broadly about your RFP process, this will help you ensure that you end up with a provider that meets all your needs. Ensure you have a full picture of the service that you will be getting and understand those additional costs that may be associated with your request. So we've stressed a lot about the transparency that we want, or that you should want providers to offer to you in these proposals. But there's a two-way transparency there to running a critical and valuable, or is critical to running a valuable RFP process. So you want to have transparency in the needs and values that you share with these potential providers. Provide detailed rate feedback, so these providers competing for your business know where and how to improve, not only in rates, but also in the services that they are providing. Compare service quality and not only rates. Have providers call out and highlight the number of services per week, or direct versus indirect offerings, allocation per lane, when they're putting forward these proposals. RFPs will always have a rate component, but make sure you have a formal process to understand the service and reliability provided with those rates.
Great, thanks, Daniel. All right, now we're going to enter into the Q&A phase of the webinar, and we already have a few questions, but we encourage you to please use your webinar app there to go ahead and ask us questions. Fire away, we'll do the best that we can to reply. In the meantime, we'll jump right into it. So, looking at the 2019 market, what are the specific considerations you would think about while creating the RFP, as it relates to pricing and market trends and those factors?
So one of the things that's been a hot topic for 2019 has been the introduction of the IMO regulations. So that's definitely one thing you want your provider to call out, and how they will mitigate any risks for that, for your business, and how they will build in those changes in the market into their proposals and the rates that they're offering. Typically what we've seen thrown out there is kind of a floating fuel mechanism, which is pretty standard in the industry. So I think that's going to be a big part of the 2019 RFP season, and something to consider when looking at these proposals and running those different scenarios against those potential changes in the market around fuel costs.
Really interesting question. Next is, how do you whittle down a short list of providers? When you're going through the research process, how do you kind of compress that list to get it more manageable?
So I think, some of the best practices that we've seen is when talking to various forwarders, make sure that you have a good, let's call it, fit along the lines of account management, of course, in terms of your relationship with that provider, but also sort of upfront vetting that you're aligned on what quality of service you can provide. Beyond that, all of those providers should be able to get to sort of the right price range. And once you've sort of pre-vetted that price range, pre-vetted those service capabilities, then you're only talking to sort of the best providers out there for your business. Adding in providers at the last minute, of course, that's up to you. But it's helpful to at least know sort of internally how serious you are about those providers.
Great. And someone asked, what do you mean by scenario analysis? A lot of things are happening in the logistics world between IMO 2020 regulations and the administration's trade war. How do you advise we account for that sort of thing? And that's a great question. And if you think about scenario planning, you could just use a fixed model of supply and demand. And on one side, supply being ample or limited, and demand being robust or weak. And you will come up with 4 quadrants, right? And each quadrant the market would obviously be responding differently. Of course, in a very high demand period where perhaps the capacity is going to be limited because forward demand is being pulled, as we saw this past Q4, then a scenario, what does that scenario look like for your supply chain? How can you adapt to it? Conversely, probably what we're seeing now is a lot of that demand, since it was pulled forward, is probably starting to slip off, and there should be, I wouldn't say ample capacity, but certainly much weaker situation than what it was during Q4. And so it should be a little bit more lax. So, okay, we have some bit more time to maneuver now, but we should be always thinking about that other scenario coming back into fruition, or at least even a balancing of supply and demand. How does that affect your supply chain? What is really important in terms of priorities if things are really tight? Great question. Our next question is about sustainability. Sustainability seems to be a growing concern for many shippers and many of their customers. Is this something providers are thinking about, and how do you vet for this?
This is a great question, and I'll just corroborate. We're definitely seeing the same thing in the market, and I think the first question to ask yourself is, what do your customers really care about, and then of course, what can your supply chain do to really impact what those customers care about, or what your executives care about, for example. And there's 2 that come to mind for me. One of them is your carbon footprint. So obviously, shipping goods around the world creates a lot of carbon emissions, and that's something that frankly, there's a good number of well-developed products in the market that allow you to offset that carbon footprint. Whereas other, let's call it externalities or costs on your supply chain, there is no product to offset those costs. Carbon is one of those where there is. So I'd recommend you ask your provider about that. Another one to call out would be sort of how to best reallocate unused inventory and get that inventory, if the product is useful, to a critical situation in the world and essentially donate those goods. What we found is a lot of clients find that to be a really valuable service rather than, for example, sort of discarding or getting rid of extra inventory. So those are 2 things I'll call out that we've seen provide a lot of value to clients, and you can ask your providers if they offer those specific opportunities. A lot of times, even with the best of intentions, it's very opaque out there how to actually take action.
Great. Another question we just received has to do with customer references, and the listener asks, customer references can be tricky. Of course, vendors are going to give you someone who speaks very well of them. Any particular recommendations or how to navigate that type of process? Yeah. So it's very true. I think if you ask the vendor itself, the forwarder themselves, of course they will provide you, put their best foot forward. So your network would be a great way to consider vetting the forwarders. chances are, if it's a sizable forwarder, if people within your professional network or even on LinkedIn you could tap into to help kind of independently validate what perhaps the forwarder is offering and suggesting in terms of services. So networking really is probably the best way. Also, there are other organizations, roundtables, et cetera, that are hosted by various different organizations, like CASME would be one, where your sourcing departments or even yourself can meet with other like-minded professionals and come together and discuss market conditions, et cetera. Okay. And lastly here has to do with the carrier alliances. And the question is, do you see any shakeup with the current ocean alliances that may affect the market? And I will say at this point, because there have been so many changes over the last few years, we do not expect any major changes in the alliances, particularly because it's so disruptive even for themselves. They have to joint procure often with various different terminals or set up their network, and that's a tremendous amount of effort. So I don't see any changes over the next year or two. However, as eventually we will enter into a recession, those will be very stressful times for the carriers, and at that point, perhaps shifting alliances can take place. But until that point comes, I think we're safe on that front. Great. So I think at this point we're out of time. There are no more questions, and we just really want to thank you all for joining. We hope you found it informative. We'll be sending out a recording of today's webinar with some related resources within the next 24 hours. We are here to help and answer any of your questions. If you hadn't thought of any at this point, we'll be happy to answer them, and you can send them to webinar@flexport.com. Thanks everyone for joining us today.